He didn't speak. But his tears told me everything. Demet finally reveals there are stories that begin with words and end with silence. And then there are stories, rare and unforgettable, that begin with silence and end with tears. For Demet Özdemir, one such story has remained locked inside her heart for years, until now. He didn't speak, she confessed in a trembling voice during her latest revelation. But his tears told me everything. With those words, she opened a door that fans had been knocking on for years, a door that led back to the night she stood face to face with Can Yaman, the man who had once been her closest confidant, her partner in love, her mirror in both joy and pain. The world has followed their journey with fascination. From the first time they appeared together on screen, the spark between them was undeniable. Their chemistry was electric, the kind that couldn't be faked. Viewers weren't just watching two characters fall in love. They were watching two souls collide. And as months passed, that on-screen magic spilled over into reality. Rumors spread, paparazzi followed, and every glance, every smile between them was dissected by millions of fans. But then, as suddenly as their connection had captivated the world, it seemed to vanish. The two drifted apart, offering no explanations. Fans were left stunned, desperate for answers. What had gone wrong? Why did a love that seemed so powerful collapse into silence? For years, both Demet and Can refused to speak about it. They moved on with their careers, their lives, their public images polished and strong. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet truth remained buried. Until Demet, in a moment of raw honesty, finally decided to break the silence. And when she did, she didn't reveal fiery arguments or dramatic betrayals. She revealed something far more haunting, the night she watched Can cry in front of her, unable to say a single word. She remembers it as if it happened yesterday. The room was dimly lit, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing against the walls. She stood just a few feet away from him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted him to fight, to explain, to promise her that they could make it through anything. Instead, he lowered his gaze, and when he finally looked up again, his eyes were filled with tears. He didn't need to speak, Demet said softly. Because in that moment, his tears told me everything I had been afraid to admit. That our love, no matter how strong, could not survive the silence that had grown between us. The image of Can Yaman, so often seen as unshakable, confident, larger than life, reduced to silence and tears, struck fans harder than any scandal ever could. He wasn't the idol adored on screens, nor the superstar celebrated across Europe. He was a man who loved, a man who hurt, a man who couldn't find the words to hold on. And for Demet, that silence was both the end and the revelation. It wasn't anger that tore them apart, but the inability to speak what needed to be spoken. It was a heartbreak written not in words, but in tears. And though years have passed, that night still lingers with her, a night that changed everything. Demet often says that some nights never truly end, they live on, replaying themselves over and over in your mind. That night with Can was exactly that kind of night. Even now, she remembers every detail as if it were carved into her memory. The room they were in was quiet, almost painfully so. Outside, the world kept moving, cars passed on the streets, laughter echoed faintly from a distance, but inside, there was only silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could feel the distance between them, though just a few steps separated their bodies. It was not physical distance, but something deeper, something unspoken. Demet's heart was racing. She wanted to scream, to break through the suffocating quiet, to force words out of him. Say something, she thought. Tell me it's not over. Tell me we can fight for this. But when she looked into Can's eyes, the words froze on her lips. What she saw there was something she had never seen before. Vulnerability. A kind of pain that no words could carry. His lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, his chest rose and fell with the weight of emotions he couldn't release. And then, finally, the tears came. They weren't loud, dramatic tears. They were quiet, almost ashamed. tears that slipped down his cheeks as though even they were reluctant to reveal themselves. For a man like Ken, always seen as strong, fearless, in control, those tears were more shocking than any words he could have spoken. Demet felt her own eyes burn, but she held them back. She didn't want to cry, not yet, not in front of him. She wanted to be strong, to believe that if she just stayed composed, she could somehow save what was slipping away. But in that moment, she realized strength wasn't enough. Love wasn't enough. His tears were a confession, and they told her everything she had been too afraid to accept. Inside, her thoughts were chaos. Why won't you speak? Why are you letting us go like this? She wanted to reach for him, to close the space between them, to shake him until he admitted what he felt. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the way his silence seemed so final, so absolute, that she knew nothing she said could change it. Later, when she spoke about it, she explained, sometimes silence carries more truth than words. I saw in his eyes that he still loved me, but I also saw that he couldn't stay. His tears told me he was already letting go. And so, they stood there, two people bound by love, separated by silence. No shouting, no accusations, no bitter words exchanged. Just two broken hearts staring at each other, unable to bridge the gap. It was the quietest ending imaginable, and yet the loudest truth she had ever faced. For Demet, that night would become a haunting memory, one she carried into every new chapter of her life. Because in that moment, she learned that sometimes the most painful goodbyes are the ones never spoken. And sometimes, the heaviest confessions are carried not in words, but in tears. Years went by, but for Demet, that night remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Fame, new roles, bright lights, red carpets, none of it was enough to erase the memory of Can's silent tears. No matter how far she traveled, no matter how high she climbed in her career, the weight of that silence followed her like a shadow. She once admitted in an interview that she could be in the middle of a crowded set, surrounded by people, laughter, and noise, and yet one glance at someone's expression could bring it all back. A certain vulnerability in another person's eyes, a tremble in their voice, and suddenly she was standing in front of him again, frozen in that room, hearing nothing but silence. It wasn't anger that she carried with her. She didn't replay bitter words or harsh arguments, because there were none. What haunted her was exactly the opposite, the absence of words. The emptiness where promises should have been. The quiet where love once lived. That silence was what echoed through the years, sometimes softly, sometimes so loudly it drowned everything else. Demet confessed, "It's strange, sometimes it feels like silence screams louder than anything." And for me, his silence never stopped echoing. Even now, it's with me. At times, she tried to push it away. She buried herself in work, pouring her emotions into her characters. Fans often wondered why her crying scenes felt so authentic, why her performances carried such raw emotion. What they didn't know was that every tear she shed on screen carried a piece of that night. People say they believe me when I cry in a scene, she revealed, but the truth is, they're not just seeing acting. They're seeing my memories. And yet, as heavy as it was, that silence also shaped her. It made her more compassionate, more attuned to the unspoken emotions of others. She began to understand that love isn't always expressed in words, that sometimes the deepest truths are carried in gestures, in looks, in the moments where language fails. Still, the pain of what was lost never fully disappeared. Demet admitted that there were nights when she lay awake replaying every second of that evening. She would ask herself, what if I had spoken first? What if I had begged him to stay? Could things have been different? But every time, the answer felt the same. His silence had already decided their fate. Nothing she could have said would have changed the truth in his eyes. For her fans, this revelation was heartbreaking. They had always imagined a dramatic end, an argument, a betrayal, something tangible they could point to. Instead, Demet's truth was quieter, but far more devastating. Their love didn't explode, it dissolved in silence. And that, perhaps, made it all the more unforgettable. Over time, Demet came to accept that the memory would always stay with her. Not as an open wound, but as a scar that told a story. A scar that reminded her of both the beauty and fragility of love. "I don't think you ever forget someone's tears," she said. "Especially when they're the last thing you see of them. They stay with you, even when life moves on." For Demet, moving on didn't mean erasing the past. It meant carrying it with her, learning from it, and allowing it to shape the woman she became. And though the silence of that night still echoed in her heart, she no longer feared it. She embraced it as part of her truth, a truth that fans across the world now share with her. For Demet, the image of Can's tears became more than just a memory, it became a mirror she would carry into every stage of her life. Whenever she looked back, she didn't see only the man she loved, she saw the moment that defined her understanding of love itself. His silence was not emptiness. It was filled with truth, with grief, with the unspoken words neither of them could bring themselves to say. On film sets, during emotional scenes, she often drew from that night. Fans wondered why her performances felt so painfully real, why her tears looked as though they carried more weight than the script alone demanded. What they didn't realize was that every role, every heartbreaking glance, carried an echo of Can's silent tears. "That memory became part of my art," she confessed. "It's why I can give so much of myself on screen, because I've lived it. I know what silence feels like." But the impact wasn't limited to her career. In her personal life, too, the silence of that night shaped her. She became more sensitive to others, more aware of the words left unspoken. "You start to notice," she explained, "that most people never say what they truly feel. And sometimes, it's in their silence, in their eyes, where the truth really is." Still, she never forgot that the silence cost her something irreplaceable. And though she never blamed Can, she often wondered if he, too, replayed that night in his mind. Did he regret not speaking? Did he remember how his tears had fallen, betraying the strength he had always shown the world? For Demet, those questions would remain unanswered, but perhaps that was the point. Their story was never about explanations, it was about emotions too big for words. When Demet finally revealed this truth to the public, the reaction was seismic. Social media erupted with posts, hashtags, edits, and messages from fans who admitted they cried reading her words. They saw themselves in her story, because everyone knows what it means to lose something without ever hearing the goodbye. Her confession became not just her own, but a universal memory shared by millions across the world. And yet, even with the global attention, Demet chose not to sensationalize it. She wasn't seeking sympathy or headlines. She simply wanted to free herself from the prison of silence she had carried for years. It wasn't about blame, she said. It was about truth. And sometimes, telling the truth is the only way to heal. For the fans, the story of Demet and Can would never be just a romance between two actors. It became a lesson, a reminder that love doesn't always end with fireworks. Sometimes it ends in a whisper. Sometimes it ends in tears. And sometimes, it doesn't really end at all, it simply lives on in the memories of those who loved deeply and lost quietly. Today, when Demet speaks about that night, there is no bitterness in her voice. No regret. Only gratitude for the love they shared, and for the way it shaped her into the woman she is. She doesn't see Can as the man who hurt her, but as the man who showed her that silence can be the loudest truth of all. "He didn't speak," she said once more, her voice steady, "but his tears told me everything. And I will never forget that." For Can, his silence continues. For Demet, her truth has finally been spoken. And for the world, their story lives on, not as a scandal, not as gossip, but as one of the most haunting love stories of their time. A story where words were never enough, where silence carried everything, and where tears wrote the final chapter. And perhaps that is why their story will never truly disappear. Because long after the lights fade, long after the rumors quiet, there will remain the image of two souls standing in a room, one unable to speak, the other unable to forget. In the end, silence became their language, and tears became their words. And though their love may have ended, its echo will live forever.